The Rouse family led a perfect life. They had everything one could dream of: a big house, 3 children, their own business, and a good reputation in the community. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Violence reigned in their house, leading to a terrible tragedy. The investigation into this case lasted 15 years, and during all that time, the officers could not shake the thought of how much rage and hatred were involved in this murder. Everyone wanted to find the culprit, but would the police be able to uncover who was guilty and what really happened? In 1980, a new decade began. People in Times Square said goodbye to the turbulent 1970s and loudly welcomed the 80s. A fragile hope accompanied the birth of a new era, and when Ronald Reagan came to power, he promised to redefine the American dream. The wealthy Chicago suburb of Libertyville, with its luxurious houses, public schools, and traditional family life where the father commuted to work and the mother stayed home with the children, was the embodiment of that dream. At that time, middle and upper-class families lived in Libertyville. It had excellent schools, and many people were employed. Libertyville was a desirable place then, and every wealthy Chicagoan would have liked to move there with their family. Chicago's North Side was a symbol of prosperity, which is why some of the most popular teen films of the decade, such as Risky Business and The Breakfast Club, were filmed there. These movies portrayed Chicago's northern suburbs as a desirable neighborhood, focusing on teenagers burdened by parental care and expectations. That was the kind of life Robin Roos led, a beautiful and popular woman who drove an expensive car around town, the darling of Libertyville. Robin was a typical American girl and the daughter of wealthy parents. She got everything she wanted, drove a nice sports car, and attended a prestigious school. She was sweet and kind, and the younger kids looked up to her. Robin and her brothers, Billy and Kurt, lived in the largest house in Libertyville. On a spacious piece of land stood an imposing home with a 3-car garage. The expensive 13-room villa had a swimming pool and a maid's cottage. Anyone who saw it was impressed. It was the epitome of the American dream. The Roos children enjoyed all the privileges their parents had lacked. Bruce and Darlin grew up in simple families and had to work hard. They met in high school and married after graduation. Bruce got a job at a gas station, and at age 21 he bought his first gas station, but that was only the beginning. The couple then bought 2 more gas stations. Darlin worked alongside her husband until they had children. Bruce woke up early, went to work, and stayed until late. He worked hard and built up his business. By the age of 24, 44-year-old Bruce had turned his gas station into an empire and become a millionaire. The Roos family owned gas stations and service stations, not only in Libertyville, but also in other cities. They invested in cable TV and owned land. The couple wanted their children to seize the opportunities available to them, follow in Bruce's footsteps, and surpass him. He gave his children what he himself had never had. To the residents of the town, the Roos family appeared to lead a perfect life, but behind closed doors, things were different. The family paid dearly for their financial success. Bruce was almost never home, working hard, and the children saw him only when they visited the gas station. He constantly expanded his business. Today, he would be called a workaholic, but back then, he was seen as a determined individualist of the Reagan era. 38-year-old Darlin was too busy with her community work to notice her husband's absence. Often, She didn't even make it home to have dinner with the children. Bruce and Darlin pursued their own goals. They wanted to establish themselves as important people, and at home, Darlin had to manage 3 children who had everything except a sense of responsibility. It was the typical generation gap. Robin was the dutiful daughter, but Kurt and Billy refused to follow the rules. Darlin confided her family's difficulties to her friends. Things got worse when 15-year-old Billy was expelled from school. During that time, he got into trouble, broke into the school, trashed the library, pulled out all the catalog cards and threw books off the shelves. Like teenagers in the movies, Billy rebelled, trying to get his parents' attention. However, their biggest worry was his older brother Kurt. He was a great football player and nearly became a state champion in wrestling, but by the time he was 21, he had lost his sense of purpose. Kurt went from being the golden boy and successful athlete to being wild. The family was not happy. All across America, neglected kids like Kurt were rebelling against success-driven parents. It seemed Kurt's main goal was to get back at Bruce and Darlin. He grew long hair and a beard, didn't work and looked like a rebel, like a werewolf. His parents threw him out of the main house, and he moved into the servant's house at the rear of the property. From then on, Kurt had little contact with his family. He roamed around, took illegal substances and alcohol, and did nothing else. His parents were unhappy because he had a good education. He had potential but no ambition. Bruce and Darlin were desperate, but like many dysfunctional families in the 1980s, they tried to hide their problems. On the evening of June 5, 1980, there was a heavy thunderstorm with lightning and torrential rain, one of the worst the locals had experienced at that time. Nights like that are not easily forgotten. Despite the approaching clouds, 16-year-old Robin Roos went for a walk, heading out with friends to a dance. Shortly before midnight, she returned home and went to bed. Thunder and lightning woke Robin briefly, but she had no idea that this would be the last time in her life she would fall asleep peacefully. On June 6, Robin was awakened by a phone call at 8:30 a.m. from one of Bruce's employees, who was looking for his boss. Bruce always got up early and left for work at 6 o'clock a.m. Robin immediately became anxious. Her father never deviated from this routine. Worried, she hung up the phone and went to her parents' room. The house was quiet. When Robin opened the bedroom door, she was confronted with a sight no child should ever see. It didn't seem likely that brutal murders could happen in the affluent area of Libertyville, Illinois, but as she opened the door to her parents' bedroom, 16-year-old Robin found herself at the scene of just such a crime. It was immediately clear that something horrific had happened, a dreadful sight no one, especially a child, should witness. Terrified and panicked, Robin woke her younger brother Billy and asked him to call the police. Billy saw the terrible scene, covered his father's and mother's remains with a sheet, and then ran behind the house to inform his older brother Kurt of their parents' gruesome death. The police arrived quickly, and they were not the only ones. Neighbors, camera crews, and reporters gathered. Local reporter Mary Laney was among those who stood outside the Roos house, trying to find out what had happened. But the reporters received no details, only that a man and a woman had been found shot to death. The children of Bruce and Darlin were in shock and unwilling to talk or be interviewed. Kurt's girlfriend, Tracy Graham, heard about the murders from a friend who had seen police officers in front of the Roos home. Tracy came over and saw the neat lawn in front of the Roos house filled with people, When she found Kurt, she hugged him. He was in shock and wanted to escape the commotion. After a while, a distraught Kurt agreed to speak to the press. "All I know is that my parents are dead. It just doesn't seem possible." While the Ruse children waited outside, the medical examiners entered the spacious house to examine the bodies more closely. The bedroom had obviously been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, items lay on the floor, and there was chaos everywhere. Everything was soaked in blood. There were heavy spatters on the wall behind the headboard of the bed. Darlin's head was blown off just above her right eye. She had a gunshot wound, clearly inflicted with the barrel held directly to her head. She likely died instantly, but Bruce's death was more agonizing. Not only was he shot, he was also beaten. He had been struck on the head with a blunt object and had 6 stab wounds on the left side of his chest. A lot of blood had flowed from them, but his heart had still been beating and blood was still circulating. He was still alive when he was stabbed. Whoever committed the murder wanted to be absolutely 100% certain that Bruce and Darlin Ruse would not survive. Investigators were able to quickly identify the type of weapon. Mrs. Ruse had clearly been killed by a shotgun blast. Shot pellets were found lodged in the furniture. They also found pellets in Darlin's face and concluded it was likely a 12 or 16 gauge shotgun. Billy told police that Bruce owned a gun, but it wasn't found during the search. Darlin's jewelry was also missing. Questions arose. Was it a robbery? Police looked for clues that might lead them to the killer. Normally, forensic technicians search for traces left by the perpetrator, fingerprints, hair, fibers from their clothing. At a crime scene like this, they collect all sorts of items. Investigators searched the entire house and discovered something strange: false walls and secret passageways throughout. It was really creepy. It was possible to move through the house unnoticed, which explained how someone from outside could commit the murders and then escape without being caught by the Ruse children. While investigators worked inside, Robin, Billy, and Kurt looked on as their parents were carried out on stretchers for the last time. The townspeople were frightened and wanted to know who was responsible and what had happened. The police had to question the children. Kurt said he had spent the evening with a woman. They went to the cliffs and then returned to his apartment. At 11:30 p.m., Tracy went home. Billy told police he had been out with friends until midnight. He added that he and his mother had talked when he got home. She asked if he was all right. Then Darlin went to bed and Billy watched TV. He fell asleep during an old detective show. Billy spoke dispassionately about that evening, while his sister Robin was overwhelmed by grief. The officers even advised her to go to the hospital to be examined and treated. Robin refused, but all 3 Ruse children left the house. After they were gone, the county police combed through the nearly 3-hectare property, hoping to find the murder weapon, but the search was unsuccessful. On June 7, 1980, the day after Bruce and Darlin were murdered, the children experienced a new nightmare. Their photos appeared in the newspaper under the headline "Murder Out of Hate." The article quoted an investigator who believed the Ruse couple had been killed out of hatred. Although the reporter did not explicitly accuse the children of killing their parents, their pictures above that headline gave the impression that they might have been involved. Residents of Libertyville began gossiping about the Ruse family and the possibility that their perfect life was just a facade. Everyone wanted to find the guilty parties, and the court of public opinion quickly reached a verdict. The neighbors believed all three children were involved in their parents' murder. Their lives seemed perfect, but was something terrible really happening in that house? Influenced by the media, people refused to believe that the children who were at home could have slept through the gunshots. The police explained that a severe thunderstorm had raged that night, and the sound of gunfire could have been drowned out by the thunder, but the rumor mill could not be stopped. People saw the case as a form of grim entertainment. The Ruse family was known to have substance abuse issues, and the neighbors knew it. The difficulties with the Ruse children were nothing unusual in wealthy families during the 80s, but news coverage turned the community against them. Many believed the children, as heirs to a large fortune, had a motive to kill their parents and live freely as they pleased. When an aunt heard about these rumors, she advised them to hire lawyers and remain silent. A planned interview with the police was canceled. The lawyers told the officers that the children would not be questioned. They stayed silent, and the police began searching on their own. A promising lead emerged from Bruce's business empire. The father owned gas stations and real estate around Chicago. Investigators received anonymous phone calls describing conflicts between Bruce and various associates. One call was of particular interest. A frightened woman phoned the investigators, claiming to know about suspicious dealings between Bruce and Darlin. But she was too scared to divulge details and hung up. That was the early 80s, with no way to trace her call. While the police were following up on these startling clues, another call came in, this time from Kurt, with an unusual request. He asked if the police could return his mother's confiscated 1973 Cadillac because he planned to go to California. Did he really want to flee to avoid punishment? The request cast a shadow of doubt on Kurt Ruse and his claim of having nothing to do with the murders. Details of Kurt's complicated relationship with his parents came to light from an unexpected source, the journalist Mary Laney. She told police about meeting a friend of the Ruse family who had relayed a shocking story. Mary said the man who called her was crying. He knew something and had spoken with Darlin Ruse shortly before the murders. He wanted to share that conversation with Mary. The journalist agreed to meet him, and he seemed deeply troubled. Darlin Ruse had told this friend that she was having serious problems with Kurt, and that she and Bruce were constantly arguing with their son. Kurt was out of control, and his parents had taken away his key to the house. A friend stated that Kurt was in financial difficulties and had demanded $30,000 from his parents, promising to move out if he got the money. Darlin refused, and Kurt told his own mother that God would punish her for it. It sounded like there was tension and violence in the home. The man truly believed that Kurt was involved in Bruce and Darlin's murder. Nor was that the only warning sign. Several people alerted police about Kurt. A close friend of the Ruse family told authorities that Darlin and Bruce were trying to force Kurt off their property with a court order. The officers had a motive. Kurt was furious that his parents had refused him the money and threatened to disinherit him. Each child of Bruce and Darlin stood to inherit $1.3 million. People have been killed for much less. Investigators returned to the crime scene to examine Kurt's home, and what they found amazed them. They discovered a pillowcase and a blue shirt with red stains that looked like blood. Serrated knives were scattered around the house. The knife or knives used to stab Bruce hadn't been found, so all of the knives were sent off for forensic testing. The results were disappointing, though. Based on the available technology in the 80s, the blood on the pillowcase and shirt most likely belonged to Kurt, not Bruce or Darlin. The knives also could not be linked to the murder, and investigators had no grounds to confiscate them. They did not give up. Soon, it became clear that Robin knew more about Kurt's possible involvement than she let on. 2 months after the tragedy, a deputy sheriff made a startling statement in court. On the day of the murders, Robin Roos had told him she suspected her brother Kurt of being involved. She never got a chance to elaborate because her aunt interrupted the questioning. The children remained silent. Usually, relatives help with an investigation, but not in this case. On October 13, 1980, 4 months after Bruce and Darlin were killed, police followed a lead, but it went nowhere. The Roos children, especially Robin, who was living with her aunt, seemed lost. She withdrew, wouldn't see her friends, and was depressed. The situation was grim. But on a cold October morning, an unexpected discovery gave new momentum to the investigation. A surveyor was walking along the banks of the Des Plaines River near the Roos house. He noticed what he thought was a stick jutting out of the water, but it turned out to be a shotgun. He immediately called the police, who sent in divers to explore the muddy riverbed for several hours, pulling up one item after another. The divers found Darlin's handbag, her driver's license, her social security card, a shotgun shell from a 16 gauge, and the guns missing from the Roos house. It was obvious these items had been stolen from the house on June 5, 1980. Investigators hoped they would find fingerprints on the recovered objects, which might identify the murderer. The police believed that the weapons, clothing, and jewelry found in the Des Plaines River would bring them closer to understanding what happened at the Roos house. The weapons were sent to the crime lab, but no fingerprints were found, and the riddle only grew more complicated. Yet the police were able to confirm one crucial fact. Lab tests showed the gun belonged to Bruce Roos. Since the crime was viewed as motivated by hatred, investigators were convinced the children were involved. They believed it was murder disguised as a robbery. Within a year, the Roos children left the state, leaving behind horrible memories, possible secrets, and an investigation that had reached a dead end. Usually, investigators revisit cold cases from time to time, looking for witnesses who may have more to say or may now be willing to talk. Robin was such a person. Many believed Kurt was the killer, and the police hoped she would finally tell them everything she knew. Of all those involved, Robin seemed the most likely to talk, as she had been closest to her parents and had found their bodies. But before the investigators could make their move, tragedy struck the Roos family again. On August 25, 1983, 3 years had passed since the worst nightmare a child could face. Robin had lost both her parents to murder. She had finished high school, found a steady job, and was preparing for college. She had moved away from the affluent Chicago suburb, where the murders took place, and settled in Racine, Wisconsin. 3 years went by, and investigators believed Robin was their best chance of learning who the killer was. Rumors circulated that she knew who was responsible for her parents' death. The police reached out to Robin to see if she could share any information about the murders, but another storm stood in their way. One night, Robin lost control of her car and crashed into a tree. She died in the accident. Whatever Robin knew about the brutal murders of her parents died with her on that rainy night. It was a huge blow to the investigation. Robin was the last possible witness who could have helped, but with her death, hope faded. On September 15, 1995, 15 years had passed since the brutal murders of Bruce and Darlene Roos. Over time, the case went cold, and no one continued to suspect Kurt, who by then lived in California. He bought land, turned his life around, got married, and had children. He managed his inheritance properly, unlike Billy, who ended up in Key West, taking in vagrants and homeless people in his house, and leading what by all accounts was a miserable life. Billy embezzled money, ran afoul of the law, and never got his life on track. But on September 5, 1995, investigators in Illinois got a call that finally gave them hope of solving the case. On October 12, 1995, Sergeant Dave asked Billy if he would be willing to talk. Billy agreed. Dave sensed that intense emotions were bubbling up. Billy seemed nauseated. He was very upset. Dave asked how he was doing, and Billy replied he was fine but having trouble processing everything. He asked the sergeant to come in the morning because he needed time to think. On October 13, 1995, investigators waited for Billy to finally tell them what happened on that horrific night when his own parents died. For 15 years, Billy had never spoken to anyone about the murders, and now he decided to confess. I decided to get rid of them. I went into the bedroom, took a shotgun, pointed it at her head, and pulled the trigger. It was unbelievable. After 15 years, with everyone suspecting Kurt, it turned out Billy had committed the murders himself. He described in detail why he had done the unthinkable. Billy described his relationship with his mother as terrible. He said there were times he wouldn't come home. The less he saw of her, the happier he was. He felt like an outcast because, in his parents' eyes, he did everything wrong. That's exactly what they told him. You do everything wrong. The first time Billy told investigators the whole truth about that night was this. On June 5, he came home drunk and completely distraught. His mother looked at him and said, "Your eyes are glassy. Have you been using illegal substances again?" He answered, "No, I haven't." She said, "You reek of alcohol," and he replied, "What's wrong with that?" She said nothing more, just told him, "We're sending you to military school." He said, "Fine, I don't care." And she told him he was going to end up just like his brother. Furious, Billy watched Darlene go to bed. He drank Bruce's whiskey, seething with rage at his mother. He also ate mushrooms. The effects of those substances, along with the pent-up anger and hatred, pushed him to grab a gun and commit the terrible act. He took his father's shotgun, walked into the kitchen to get a knife, then crept into the bedroom, protected by the darkness and the raging storm. Billy placed the shotgun to his mother's head and fired. She died instantly. He hadn't intended to kill his father, but Bruce woke up. My father sat up and looked at me, and I pulled the trigger again, but it didn't go off. I went around the bed and hit my father with the butt of the gun. It didn't help. He was twitching. I didn't want him to suffer. I grabbed a knife and stabbed him until he stopped moving. After the murder, Billy quickly sobered up and tried to make it look like a robbery. He ransacked the bedroom, took his mother's jewelry box and purse, gathered all the guns in the house, put them in his father's car, and drove to the Des Plaines River to throw them in. He considered running away, but realized it would look suspicious. I turned the car around and drove home. Then I fell asleep. The next morning, my sister woke me. The 37-minute confession gave the police all the information they needed. Billy was immediately extradited to Libertyville. Reporters announced that Billy Ruse had been arrested for the murder of Bruce and Darlin, and no one could believe it. He had let people suspect his own brother for years. It was heartbreaking for Kurt to learn that Billy was guilty. "I mean, I didn't kill anyone, and I don't know who the murderer is or if my brother is guilty. That's it," was all Kurt could say when asked for a comment. Kurt's anguished statement and Billy's detailed confession on tape convinced the jury of his guilt. After 8 hours of deliberation, Billy was found guilty of double murder. In October 1996, 16 years after the tragedy, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He showed no remorse for killing his mother, but expressed regret for killing his father. Billy also said he regretted hurting his sister Robin, explaining that it broke her and that he felt sorry. In Libertyville, people have never forgotten the terrible story of the son who brutally murdered his wealthy, successful parents. It is still talked about today. It is the tragic story of a perfect family and the ugly truth that hid in the shadows. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.